Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We're back. That was so incredible. It's like you don't even really quite know. Well, let me just start by asking, what is the dhikr?
It's, verse 5.
Verse 5. Okay. So, I mean, and Mabruk for finishing it in one session. Although, you know, we're going to have, like, I think a number of questions, and so part of the question, let's see how we do on time, because we're already almost 10 o'clock, so we usually leave about 45 minutes for questions. You know, it's just really mind-blowing when we start like putting all of these surahs, because we've been getting late Meccan surahs, one after another, and it's so fascinating to when you start putting them together and understanding that the picture that it's creating, and then just the way that you've, you know, continued to place in our minds, you know, this is what they were going through, they were a persecuted people, this is a message that you're getting. It's like, it makes it so, like, come alive in a way that I think, you know, I had never experienced as a convert hearing anywhere, and you know, it's like every time with every single surah, everything we learn, you just feel like, how could this not be just a very vibrant part of our tradition that we're continually thinking about?
Well, if you make it feel any better, it's not just as a convert, but this approach is just not, it's not experienced by any Muslim, because they just in the modern age it just hasn't I mean, let's set aside the existential questions of why me and all of the things like that, and just you know, the point is just that it's, yeah, it is the truth.
Well, it had to be you, because no one is as obsessive about books. Well, actually, now we have we have Rami and Joe who are in competition, so maybe they're the next generation of crazy book people that can carry this forward.
Maybe Joe, Rami's not even close.
But, you know, I mean, you know, subhanAllah, it's like, even with this, you know, like, you know, when we still have like all these surahs coming at us at 1,000,000 miles an hour, you know, like even this one with the idea of justice, and, you know, every single surah talks about justice. But, you know, in Shura, it's like everyone thought they understood what that meant, but the idea of you know, like the bee, and the idea that it's not just about justice, but it's also about individuals, like, you know, the whole idea of dignity, and, you know, like making people feel like they are able to contribute whatever their best purpose is in the context of diversity, in the context of justice, in the context of creating a society, you know. And then I think about the things that we've learned through other surahs, even like the respect of animals and all of that. And I was reminded last night in our reflection group, you know, you shared this story about our white German Shepherd, Luda,
Yeah.
who is like our most insane dog, that, you know, like, is anytime Luda is happy, it's a she, I would say he, because it feels like a he, but she spins. And it's like the funniest thing. It's like in the most random times and places, you know, in the tightest of spaces, you know, I'm trying to do something, she's happy that I'm there, she comes and she just starts spinning. And it's like, I've never seen a dog do this before. But, and then you were telling a story about how she ended up on my side of the bed just because she felt like it. But the idea that is an expression of an animal that feels like free to be itself, it's happy, it's, you know, like being, you know, it's just expressing whatever God put in, you know, this personality and this character. And, you know, you can't help but think about, like, okay, that's what we have to allow for our human beings, which we don't, in order to fully allow them to be happy and feel free to be expressive, and then be free to go to the next level of creating a society and think about diversity and think about, you know, creating a civilization and all of that. And it just all starts coming together, as you say, in a symphony, not just in one surah, but the whole thing. So it's very exciting to be able to just start seeing all of those pieces to come together. So just to, again, express, you know, my gratitude. This is amazing. I don't know how we would ever have the occasion to understand anything like this without Project Illumine, without you, without all the time you invested. So it just, you know, and with every surah, it just gets that the amount we have to pay back, and you know, the gratitude and everything just layers on and on and on. So I mean, it's almost like you want to say, stop, the accountability is too high. Like, how are we going to pay this back? But alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, thank you so much. So, okay.
You guys asked for it. I mumbled, you guys asked for it. Because, yeah,
Yes.
for years I didn't want to do it.
Oh my God. Okay, and 46 down, right? Is this the 46 or the 47? 46 down. And how many more to go? Who's good at math? Oh my gosh. Yeah, last night the Sheikh was saying, yeah, you don't know yet what is yet to come. So we're waiting. Okay, who would like to kick off? Rami, do you want to start with your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Rami had two questions. He was going to pass one tomorrow, but actually you just pass one to Henry. Henry can represent and ask one of those.
46.
Sorry, what were you saying?
I thought, just in case it wasn't clear what the story of Ludo was, I was like...
Please, tell us.
No, I was just saying that what Grace was referring to is that yesterday I was telling them that Allah teaches us that Allah's sunnah, Allah's laws can be witnessed in all levels of creation, and that even an animal and the same thing that makes a human being oppressed and broken is what makes an animal oppressed and broken. It's the same logic. And when an animal is with all the instinctiveness that an animal reflects, but when an animal is constrained from expressing the self, they're unhappy. And when an animal has that level of freedom where they are not scared to express themselves, they're happy. And the same applies to human being. And so what I'm saying is that Luda, the dog Grace was mentioning, doesn't normally jump on our bed, doesn't normally like to sleep in our bed. But I noticed one night as I was passing through that Luda had jumped on Grace's side of the bed and was lying there and seemed so happy and so content. And I realized that as I was looking at the dog, the fact that she looked at me and wasn't scared, she knew that she had nothing to worry about. I'm not going to yell at her, I'm not going to chase her, and so on. That's what made this dog happy. And the same for a human being. If a human being lives in fear, in anxiety, so it's Allah speaks to us through the ayat that Allah has encoded, not just in the Quran, but in creation, constantly. It's just, if only we would pay attention. And it's just learning to read the language. That's all it is.
Okay. My question is about verses 39 through what was it? Yeah, 43. You talked about how 39 is about establishing the mechanisms of redressing injustices, and so the language hum yantasirun, Ibn Ajiba explains as yantaqimun min dhulmihim. They redress the injustice that has been imposed against them and he mentions like how others understood this verse as really being about the dignity of humans, and that a Muslim should never be submissive or weak or meek. So my question is, because the language is interesting, I was wondering if, sorry, I'm rambling, but because when I read this, I was like, how can anyone, the same thought occurred to me, is like, how can anyone think Islam is consistent with an unjust circumstance? But 39 seems, because the pronoun shifts between 39 to 43, the relative pronoun, it starts with alladina, and it suggests addressing an imperative for a group. So I was wondering if 39 is about sort of more macro societal issues, and because then it talks about things relating to a collectivity, Shura, establishing prayer. The understanding that the community has to establish prayer, sharing wealth as a collectivity, and then the pronoun switches to men when talking about forgiveness and patience. So I was wondering, could 39 be read to be more broadly as like not just process and procedures of justice, and I don't want to limit your take what you mentioned in tafsir to that, but there's more to expand in the sense of resistance, protest, etc., things of that nature. That was one question, Grace. Is there? Should I? The other one is kind of short.
Yeah, go ahead and just like maybe add.
Okay,
We're thinking of just combining
yeah.
questions for the interest of time. So Rami will ask two, and then you can answer.
Okay.
As you wish.
So the other is the idea of wilaya, which I thought was really prominent in the surah. It comes up in, I counted at least like 7 or 8 verses, and the idea of Allah saving us from our follies that you mentioned several times, the hierarchy between Allah and the Prophet, the fact that the Prophet is not a wali, he's a conveyor of the message, and the reference, to the rain and the ships. What can be said about the idea of wilaya in the context of the surah?
The second question, what can be said about the idea of wilaya, I think, I don't have much to add to that other than that the surah, because the issue of wilaya, or what you mean by wilaya in this context, it will be brought up or will be addressed more precisely and clearly in other surah. But in the context of Surah Shura, it is clearly I would prefer to see it as an issue of addressing the reality of diversity. That the Prophet, even the Prophet, is not there to snuff out diversity. And he has no authority to snuff out diversity. And the challenge, if you reflect upon the entire narrative of the surah, it's part of preparing Muslims to dealing with the ongoing reality of diversity that is the only perhaps stronger statement of about diversity is وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ, that وَلَا يَزَالُوا مُخْتَلِفِينَ وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ, which is, but it's in a different surah. But so we clearly know that the surah it underscores again that the Prophet doesn't control and is not sent and that even after the hijrah it will come back and emphasize that the Prophet doesn't play the role of a controller. And then beyond that, it invites serious reflection on what conditions would maximize justice, what conditions would maximize al-intisar min al-baghi, what conditions would maximize shura, what conditions the Quran is not like a tax code or a book of it's not a legal document that sets out rules to run anything, but it sets out principles, and it must be read as the Quran itself says by with tafakkur and ta'aqqul and deep reflection. About al-intisar min al-baghi, which is the entire issue, there are so many layers. First, al-intisar min al-baghi, meaning redressing aggression, defending oneself against aggression is a right. Al-intisar min al-baghi haqq, and that is said by nearly every source. But then beyond that, al-tanasur li-daf'i al-baghi, how you can come together to repel aggression. So whatever are the conditions, whatever the requirements there are to التناصر لدفع البغي, أي تناصروا لدفع البغي, in a normative sense, that you must be able to, what do you call it, a system, a process, a principle of tanasur, in aiding one another, coming together to address aggression. Now, under that category, you can write volumes of things. But of course, there's the ethic of bravery in Daf al-Baghi. And this is what Ibn Ajiba focuses on. And a lot of the Sufi-esque tafsir, they focus on that element, that that one must have hamiyya, one must have bravery, one must not be a coward, that to be able to not just simply suffer injustice and convince oneself that I'm forgiving, while in truth you're just a coward. And this is an ethic at an individual and at a collective level, because it can also exist collectively. All of it is included under وَإِذَا أَصَابَهُمْ بَغْيٌ يَنْتَصِرُونَ. Now, the part that I was perhaps emphasizing is تهيئة الظروف المؤدية لانتصار الحق على البغي. that you create the conditions so that you don't, so every occasionality doesn't raise challenges that are met individually and separately, meaning that not every time that you are confronted with injustice, you then, you see who's brave, who has the strength, who, let's get people together to respond to injustice, but to create a system that can respond to injustice at a regular and systematic and consistent basis. And every theory of real justice goes back to what in Arabic is tahiyyatul dhuruf. How do you organize society? How do you organize law? How do you organize the political system? How do you organize so that you can create a system that responds to injustice? And so, in many ways, it's just at a deeper level that, when you have a mujtama' qabali, when you have a tribal society, what fills the gaps left by law and administration and policy is al-hamiyya, is that in a tribal society you can, call for your clan, you call for your family, you can call for, and you say, help me, and they rush to your help. But the more and more you get to a settled society or a non-tribal society, the more you cannot count on that element anymore. And then you have to have a system, because relying on the fervor of the moment is very precarious. And it is incumbent that we read the Quran within the epistemology of our age. And very few of us, Muslims, continue to exist in tribal societies. So to continue to simply see this as an issue of bravery and guts and fervor is very dangerous. We sell ourselves short.
I think that there's a very widespread misconception, which now after this halaqah I realized that I had as well, about what Shura actually means. And it seems like the misconception is that it's simply a form of consultation that creates inequality of voice. And it reminded me of something that happened with the masjid that always didn't sit well with me for a very long time. Like, I wonder, okay, they were implementing Shura, but where did they go wrong within the framework of that misconception? There was a masjid during the 70s or 80s where they had a board. It was run by people who were qualified, and a majority came in, and it became the majority who were not qualified. And simply because there was a process of Shura, they were able to push out, and they literally did push out everyone who had been there, who started that masjid. Mm-hmm. And so it seems like that can be one aspect. The quality of voice is certainly a mechanism of Shura, but to limit it to that can inevitably or possibly create injustice and inequity, because it doesn't seem like really justice is just equality, but it is most definitely equity, which would consider in that context someone's qualifications, how much someone is contributing to an effort. I have two questions. That's the first one, is what in our modern era in creating organizations, because obviously we understand at the governmental level, in creating organizations, what are the different objectives that we should have in mind when implementing Shura? And then the second question is in regards to the verse about God doesn't speak to humans except through, but from behind a veil. What does that mean exactly?
Okay, so the question about Shura is Shura is a dynamic that leads to the production of goodness while preserving the participatory principle, while honoring the worth and dignity of the participants. Now, in our modern age, it is easier to say what Shura is not. Like simply giving someone an opportunity to just have an opinion is not Shura. I think in our modern age, giving the right task to the right person is part of Shura. Having a participatory model where people can where people can generate ideas, and it doesn't mean that every idea must be equally implemented, but it means that people can feel a sense of worth and a sense of creativity and a sense of validation. Not every organization is what is required for an Islamic society. It doesn't mean that every organization must be thoroughly Shura-esque. That's not the, so if you can't come to a grandpa and grandma store and say, well, you've got to run the store according to a Shura system. It is, not every time human beings get together is a microcosm of an Islamic society. Because that would run counter to a system of rights. I mean, can you imagine if, I remember, I don't even remember which hospital stay it was, but someone was telling me that a doctor, I think, was complaining that people who are not doctors have, which sounded really crazy to me, but that like nurses or medical aides, or I don't remember exactly, but that they were not doctors, but that basically they have their voice is given equal weight to a doctor in complaining about and that how much disruption it was causing in the hospital. And this was a really badly run hospital. This was the hospital near Thousand Oaks, where it was just miserable. I mean, I could tell that it was very dysfunctional. I mean, the nurses, I could tell that they couldn't stand the doctors couldn't stand the nurses. The service was horrible, everything was horrible. And, obviously that's not what is, there's a way you can give people a sense of dignity and a sense of value, but at the same time respecting specialization and respecting levels of knowledge and levels of expertise and so on. And this is precisely where I think the idea, when you understand this in the context of understanding what takes place in the dynamic of production of honey is useful, is that no one size will fit all. But what Shura would look like at the level of a nation state is going to be very different than how Shura looks like at the level of company or an NGO or at a level of a small partnership or at the level of a family. In a family where you have, a small circle of people, it Shura might mean that on some issues the mother should have the last say. And on some issues the father should have the last say. And on some issues the children should have some say or no say or all the say. It depends. But what is core is that all must feel their sense of self-worth and dignity. And when you look at even those who complain that the Shura was destroyed and the Khilafah now has become mulk, what was it that they were saying? They were saying, we have real grievances about an elite who enjoys a privilege with no means for our grievances to be heard or addressed. And while in our modern age, I think Shura in our modern age probably must look like a democracy because we can't think of a better system to honor it's not because democracies are perfect, but because in our modern age, no one has been able to come up with a better system. That even a constitutional monarchy is no, the constitutional monarchy in our modern age with all that modern human beings have become, it seems absurd because it still will preserve privilege and elitism and so on. But at the time, 1,000 years ago, Shura didn't mean democracy and didn't necessarily have to mean democracy because the consciousness and the psychology of people was very different. So it's very dangerous to think in terms of prefabricated straitjackets. Dignity and participation. It's the core of Shura. The other question, literally what it means about God speaking behind a veil, it means that in Judaism, in the Torah, God interacts with human beings like another human being. And in fact, we know that Jacob wrestles with God and beats God. In Christianity, God sends Godhead, the Son, who interacts with human beings and then is crucified. And we often forget that in so much of human history, we humanize God. And even in our modern age, we humanize God. We turn God into effectively, someone who is like a teddy bear, who just loves us unconditionally. And like our Hollywood image of the Hollywood what do you call it? What is the looking word for? The Hollywood partner, the typical Hollywood romantic story of unconditional love, blah blah blah, so on and so forth. So literally, what it means is that God speaks to human beings through a prophet. God speaks to human beings as God spoke to Moses, where Moses heard a voice but couldn't see God, and then when he asked to see God, God says, I'll reveal myself to a mountain, and it won't, it will crumble once, and or as God spoke to Ibrahim through inspiration, not through a an angel or through a voice, but through a dream. So the distance between the divine and human being, but that's the literal meaning. But the substantive meaning is that the distance between the divine and the human is exemplified in لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There is nothing like God. So the type of deprecating of divinity into the cesspool of humanity is deeply, deeply troubling. And it has horrible consequences.
Thank you. Question from Joe. What a halakha. Thank you so much, Sheikh. My question, does the process of Shura guarantee a just outcome? Or can a just process in theory still lead to unjust ends? I'm thinking about how many unjust policies and actions, past and present, enjoy... Oops, sorry. Oh, what's my thing? Okay, I'm thinking about how many unjust policies and actions, past and present, enjoy a democratic mandate. The Surah seems at first to be speaking on a societal level. I think the professor said this, but society is surely only as ethical as the individuals who comprise it. If the participants of Shura are themselves not committed to justice, then how can Shura produce tamkeen, or empowerment and goodness? Following this logic, the real message of Shura does not start on the societal macro level. The Shura is first and foremost, above all, a call to work on the self, and perhaps this is why prayer precedes Shura in verse 38.
No, I completely agree. I mean, and I don't think just democracy. There are many democratic systems that have what it depends on how the definition of democracy, because we often ignore that there's so many definitions of democracy. I mean, depending on your theory of democracy, you would either count the U.S. as a democracy or not. You would either count, and some theories of democracy, the U.S. is a polyarchy and not a democracy. I mean, the Robert Dahl himself said this. And same thing with Britain. There are many theories of democracy where Britain would not qualify as a democracy. So just because we call something a democracy, it doesn't mean that we have even externally a Shura system. Is it really a democracy if there are deep inequities between classes? Is it really a democracy if there are deep-seated racism and race politics creates deep hierarchies in power that are pretty much unmovable? Is it still a democracy if you have a system that is corruptible by special interest money and the ability of special interest money to thwart all sorts of policies and lobbying and so on? We forget all too often that it wasn't that long ago that even those who founded American democracy warned about special interests and the corrupting impact of special interests. I often wondered if George Washington, if he came today, whether he would even classify the U.S. as a democracy. If you read the thought of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, both, I think they would have a very hard time classifying the U.S. as a democracy as it exists today, because of all the things that they warned about actually happened. So, and That's why I think it is really important. And I think completely agree with you about it starts with the individual, but I think it is also really important that we understand the moralistic nature of when we say shura. In many ways, in my view, we are talking about a real democracy. We are talking a democracy in which there is the institutional means by which we can avoid ills like classism, racism, special interests like corporatism, and the types of things that give the outside veneer, the optics of participation. I mean, one person, one vote is not. That's not what a democracy is about. I mean, it's one of the things that is important for democracy, but that's not it. It's not just a matter of every once in a while, every 4 years you go and, or once every whatever years you go and cast a vote, and then we say, oh, since we have that as a democracy, and that's the problem we have, for instance, with Israel. Just because you have elections and you have a certain group of people, even a corrupt politician like Netanyahu, who has been playing musical chairs with his fellow elites for God knows how long. Is that a democracy? It's the same exact corrupt group of white privileged Jews that keep playing musical chairs over and over and over. At the expense of numerous people. First and foremost, the Palestinians. Is that a democracy? The optics are very deceptive. And I think when Muslims, because Muslims are a colonized people, they always talk about Shura as whether it's a democracy or not a democracy. As if that's the objective. No. Shura is beyond you should aspire for Shura to be beyond democracy, to be real democracy, true democracy.
Building on Joe's point about it starting with the individual, I thought it was really interesting in that same verse 36, where after avoiding major sins and major immoralities, number 2 is anger.
Yeah.
And that comes
Yeah.
before prayer.
Before prayer.
So just thought it would be interesting.
Because at the social level, because it's talking about social level. Because anger is the great corrupter of justice and the great access point for demons.
But at an individual level, especially.
Yeah, and especially at an individual level. Yeah.
Any more questions here? I just had one, actually, just a clarification, which I thought was really fascinating when you talked about repentance, true repentance, and you were reading that passage. And you said there were 6 parts, but I only captured 5. So I just want to make sure that we didn't miss one, or maybe it was just the way it was counted. So. And then in the meantime, while you're looking for that, Joe also reminded me that the Sheikh gave a really powerful khutbah called The Higher Aspirations of Justice from February 7th of 2020, where he talks about verses 37 through 43 in Surah Al-Shura. So if anybody's interested in doing further study, I would say I'd recommend checking that out. Thank you, Joe.
So what was okay? So the first, this is the from Ali bin Abi Talib radiallahu anhu. So it says first is regret about past sins. Do you have that?
Oh, actually, I missed that one.
Okay.
So the first one I had was if you miss prayer or fasting, make it up.
No, the first is على الماضي من الذنوب الندامة. Regret about past sins.
Okay, and the rest I had, if you miss prayer or fasting, make it up. If you commit an injustice, you need to either compensate, address, or fix it.
Right.
In the same way you built upon sin, you have to melt it with regrets.
Right.
And then the way you tasted joy and pleasure of sin, you have to address with equal measure the bitterness of repentance.
Right.
And you should have tears to replace every laughter.
Right.
Okay, that's 6. Thank you. Okay, any last bit? I think we're actually very close. We're out of time now, right? It just flies by. Yes, we're out of time. 10:40. Okay. Alhamdulillah, thank you so much for an amazing surah. I can't wait to see what's next. Actually, I'm excited for Al-Araf, now that you've given us a hint to what is to come. So inshallah, may Allah present that at the right time.
Al-Araf is a long surah.
Okay, so inshallah, may it fall on a Saturday, not too long from now.
Yeah.
Okay,
a
everybody,
long surah.
thank you so much for joining us. And inshallah, we hope to see you Tuesday. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend. See, now we wave here because these guys are actually here.
Oh.
They're here now.